live on Facebook as well.
Yes, so let's see. It is 8.
Yep.
So shall we just start off? If the speakers could start the microphones and the cameras as well. Yes, now we are able to see you clearly.
I'll start with the video, the Jason introduction.
Yeah.
The video is not working.
Okay, so normally we would like to show you a webinar over like a video which tells you something about about our organization, but due to some technical difficulties, we are not able to show you the video. So to give a brief overview, we are part of Jason Institute, an organization which has the aim of informing students and young professionals on the topics of conflict-related issues. And tonight we will be speaking about the conflict in Yemen, or the crisis in Yemen, and different aspects on it with the 3 specialists you see in front of you. Uditi, if you would like to start off.
Yes. So today, my name is Uditi, and Marcin and I will gonna be the host of today's webinar on Yemen, crisis in Yemen, and conflict of proxies. To have a fruitful discussion on the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Yemen, a country which has been deemed as a failed state by the international community, I would like to welcome 3 distinguished guest speakers. First of all, we have Ms. Helen Lackner, the author of Yemen in Crisis, Autocracy, Neo-Liberalism, and the Disintegration of a State. Next, we have Dr. Joost Hiltermann, the Program Director of Middle East and North Africa at the Crisis Group. He's also a lecturer on politics in the Middle East and at the Brussels School of International Studies. And thirdly, and finally, we have Mr. Peter Derrek Hof, the Dutch ambassador to Yemen. Before we start the program, we have a little bit of overview what we're going to discuss. So there are going to be 3 main subtopics that we'll be focusing on tonight. The first is the conflict and history. Second is the humanitarian crisis itself. And third is the looking into the future. And of course, we also have a Q&A time for the audience. If you have any questions, please put them on in the Q&A chat box, and we will pick them up. Martijn, the floor is to you now.
Yes, so obviously we're quite interested to know a bit more about the specialists themselves. And one question that we always start off with is our main motivation for joining the current webinar. So I would like to start off with Mr. Hiltermann. What was your main motivation of joining tonight's webinar?
Well, the main motivation is you were so kind in inviting me. I couldn't possibly say no. But it's also because I think it's very important to highlight what is going on in Yemen today. It is, according to the UN, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world at this moment. And it's also a crisis that's not very visible. It doesn't produce great numbers of refugees, which is something that can be very visible. We saw it a few years ago with Syria. And so with the relative invisibility, there is also less pressure on governments to do something about it. So from us as a conflict prevention organization, it's really important to shed a light on what is going on and to direct the focus of governments towards not just providing humanitarian aid, but bringing this war to an end, since that is the only real solution to the humanitarian crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to ask some question to Mrs. Lackner.
Yeah, well, I think Joost has really already answered. I mean, all I would like to add is that, you know, given how little is known and said about the crisis in Yemen, it's important to remember that Yemen is a country of about 30 million people, of whom the vast majority are suffering from this humanitarian crisis, and almost all of whom are hoping to see the end of this war and the solution, even though at the moment, I think today and yesterday is probably the greatest hope I've come across in many years. I still think it's very, well, one still needs to be extremely skeptical that a solution is coming too soon.
Okay. And another person who is also quite involved in the current situation, Mr. Hof, what was your main motivation of joining tonight's webinar?
Yes, I'm very sorry. I'm very honored to be here, but sorry that I have to repeat what the previous speakers have said, because I fully agree with what they say. It is vital that we talk about Yemen. So I'll welcome any interest in Yemen, and especially from youth and from students, and as ambassador of the kingdom from the Netherlands, also from a Dutch student organization. I believe that in the end, only the Yemeni people can find the durable solution to the conflict and the path forward to an inclusive peace. But they can only do it if the region plays a more positive role in the conflict, and if the international community contributes. So indeed, we need to raise the profile. We need to put Yemen higher on the international agenda. Any attention helps. Thank you.
Okay, well, obviously we try to inform our public on the topic as well as much this evening, and we'll try to see if we can inform them on possible solutions. But first, we would like to start off with the conflict and the history side, just to help inform the public a bit more about the, well, not really the reasons, but like the thought process behind why is there a conflict. And the first question we have is related to the Arab Spring. So in 2011, the Arab Spring spread to Yemen, with approximately 20,000 people taking to the streets and calling for then President Ali Abdullah Saleh to resign. People from different walks of life joined the demonstration against Saleh, including the tribes. And this is the general question. So I will start off with Mr. Hiltermann. What was the main trigger for people to finally lead the demonstrations against Saleh?
Well, we have to remember that the Arab Spring, or the popular uprisings in 2011, were triggered first in Tunisia, and then they spread to Egypt and to Libya. And so everyone in the region everyone was watching this in the wider region, you know, across the board, Middle East, North Africa, even beyond. And so in Yemen as well. And the thing is that people across the region had very similar grievances. They might be some might be specific to their particular ruler, their particular government, their particular political system, but there were many things in common, and it was really about the legitimacy of their governing systems and whether they were providing the kinds of services that they had come to expect as part of a bargain between ruler and citizen. Because the thing is, in the Middle East, people were quite willing to put up with a certain degree of autocracy, and I say this with care because, of course, there's also a lot of democracy advocates, but a lot of ordinary people really can put up with quite a bit as long as the government provides security and services and jobs and things like that. But when the autocrat becomes deeply corrupt, and basically hands power or threatens to hand power to his sons. And when the services dry up, and because of that and for other reasons, then people have, start expressing their grievances. And the thing is, with the uprisings in North Africa, people saw that the autocrats weren't so secure in the saddle and could be overthrown. And I think in Yemen, people saw that and decided that their turn had come as well. And they were not alone. Of course, elsewhere in the Middle East also, people rose up. So that is really what happened. And they said, listen, the social contract that has bound us together is no longer working. And so either you reform and you bring the change that and fulfill the satisfy the demands we are making, or you've got to go. And in the end, Ali Abdullah Salah had to go. And this was, in this case, and because in different countries it happened in different ways, it was affected through the intervention of the Gulf Cooperation Council, who basically pushed him aside and put in his deputy as interim president.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting points. And then I would like to pass on the question to the other specialist, Mrs. Lackner. Do you agree with the points of Mr. Hiltermann, and would you like something to add to the question?
Yes, I totally agree with his points. Just a couple of short things to add. First, that the Yemenis had already been demonstrating for many months before the triggers of Tunisia and Egypt happened. But I think the importance of the triggers was really that they gave people hope and encouraged and developed the movement enormously. I mean, I was in the middle of summer when Mubarak fell, and I was on a third floor flat working with a colleague, and suddenly the whole street, the whole town, you know, just exploded. And it was very obvious. I mean, although people had been demonstrating and there were already sit-ins and almost live-ins, I never found the right word for that, you know, that moment of actually believing that the things could change. I think that was the biggest impact. In terms of the general grievances, I mean, I think Host has already covered them. You know, basically, you know, there was the issue of democracy, but there was also very much the issue of worsening poverty, which had been affecting the population for the previous 10 to 15 years. So you'd had, after the initial hope of unification in 1990, you had about 4 or 5 years, even though they were very tough because of what happened in the Gulf War and the isolation of Yemen after 1990. And that created a major economic crisis with, you know, almost 1 million people coming back from the Gulf. So, but the first few years were years of hope and enthusiasm, particularly political hope. But economically, the situation was bad and stayed bad, and very much the intervention of the structural adjustment programs and other policies that were supported and implemented by the Salah government, you know, contributed to increasing dissatisfaction. So by the time we got to 2011, you also had 2 other factors that contributed to that, which were one, the 6 wars that had happened in the previous 6 years against the Houthis up in the north, and the increasing importance of the separatist movement in the south. So basically, you'd had this whole combination of factors, which meant that, you know, the population was extremely frustrated. And then came, you know, Salah's proposal for changing the constitution so that it would enable his son to take over at the next election. So all of these things combined by 2010. And so you already had a very, you know, very explosive situation. Thanks.
Okay. So, Mr. Hof, obviously broad answers have already been given, but with your background as a diplomat, is there something that you would like to add, or what is, in your opinion, the main trigger for people to demonstrate against Salah?
As you know, I'm a diplomat. I'm not an academic. I'm not an analyst. And with Yemen only since last year. So my knowledge on history comes to a large extent from books like the ones that have been written by Helen. So I do not have a lot to add to what has been said by the previous speakers. But I think it is fair to say that what we saw in that period, indeed, as Helen has pointed out, and what I still notice when I talk to the many Yemeni I talk to, that at one time, it was at the same time probably a period of hope, a beacon of hope of the Yemeni people. We saw groups, marginalized groups in society, participating in debates, participating in the National Dialogue Conference, women's groups, many youth, minorities. So on the one side, we saw this basically the zenith of positivity, and at the same time already the the seeds for the conflict that we saw afterwards. The Houthis not being satisfied, well, the southern issue, as has been mentioned by Helen. So we already saw, of course, the seeds for decline that happened afterwards, and that makes us face currently the biggest humanitarian crisis as has unfolded in Yemen.
Okay, thank you very much. And as we are talking of Mrs. Helen over Mrs. Lackner's her book, we would like to zoom in a bit more on the specific tribes and like more the history towards the tribes. So Mrs. Lackner, as you describe in your book, Yemen is quite a tribal society, and tribes are fundamental elements of the social fabric. However, it seems that the power of the tribes have been disintegrated under Salah's rule, which shows that tribes joined the demonstrations. In this sense, what was the relationship like between the tribes and Salah, which resulted in the disintegration of the tribes?
Thank you for the question, but I have to first say that I don't think we can say the tribes have disintegrated. Okay. So I think it's very important to note that the tribes have been and remain and will remain a very important factor in Yemeni society. I think the other thing is there's a tendency to see tribes as some peculiar phenomenon which is different from other forms of social organization. Tribes are just one form of social organization which is complementary to the state, which is complementary to professional associations, which is complementary to a class structure, etc. So it has, and for example, one of the things that tribes do, particularly Yemen and many other countries where you don't have a state social security system, for example, is that they provide social security for their people. The other thing is that, and I think that's where your question really refers to, is the assumption that a tribe is one totally united, coherent, cohesive institution. Tribes, like all other organizations, have their sections and their divisions. And so you have, for example, one of the biggest tribes in the far north of Yemen, the Hashed, you have Hashed people who are with the Houthis, you have Hashed people who are with Hadi, you have Hashed people who are with neither of them. And you have Hashed people who may have totally different views. So you can't just treat them as a single, cohesive entity. A third point I think is very important to make when you're talking about Yemen is you have two major big tribal confederations in the far north. The one I just mentioned, the Hashed, the second one is the Bakil. There's a third, much looser and less cohesive confederation, which is called the Mudhead. In the southern parts, you have basically the Aulaki and maybe the Yafiri, but you don't have, throughout the country, you have tribes, but a lot of them can be very, very small and not cohesive. For example, if you look around the Taiz area, where some people, particularly educated people, say, we're not tribal, we don't have tribes. But as soon as something happens, they all go back to their tribes, but they are small ones. So, the important thing is to treat tribes as a specific type of institution, which is also not completely united. So it's very important to take them into consideration, but not to treat them as some peculiar exotic phenomenon that is, a sort of a thing you find in Yemen in some other strange places. There's certain features of tribes which are quite similar to other features we'd find here in Europe. I won't go into the details because we could go on for hours and I'm sure you want to move on. But I think the important thing is to have a much more sophisticated approach and less caricatural, I would say. I don't want to be unpleasant, but there is this tendency, not from you, but in a lot of the literature and in a lot of the action, to treat them as this weird entity that has to be looked at very differently.
Okay, so now we have talked about the tribes and what divides them and how we should regard them. Obviously, there's a national aspect as well. So that's the next question will be about this national aspect, because in the 1990s, the Yemen Arab Republic and the Democratic Republic of Yemen became united, establishing the Republic of Yemen. However, under Salah's regime, this reality of a united Yemen became a bitter experience for many people in the south, leading to new sovereign separatist movements in 2007. Mrs. Lackner, obviously you have given some details on the tribes, but could you, in your book, you explain that the south and the north are similar yet different in many ways of social political perspective. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more about these differences and also the sovereign perspective of a united Yemen?
Yeah, I think this is an important question. I mean, the other questions are also important, but it's something that's very prominent at the moment, and particularly, I think, in the political debate in terms of negotiations. As you said, there were two separate states. But you had very close relations between Yemenis of all parts of Yemen. And if you look at Yemen in a cultural way throughout the country, there are differences in music, in food, between a Hadrami in the southeast and the guy from Saada, or a woman from Saada in the far north. But there is, in my view, a kind of, a Yemeni nation. There's enough things that bring Yemenis together to be called a nation. I mean, some of us older people will remember the days when things like Arab unity was promoted by Nasser and some others. I never believed in Arab unity. I thought this was a completely unrealistic concept that would never happen. But when people talked about Yemeni unity in the 70s and 80s, I thought there was, it stood to reason because of this social and cultural coherence you had. And before 1990, unity was very much the dream of everybody in Yemen. I mean, everybody say, the vast majority of people, everywhere you'll find some dissidents. I remember distinctly, people, I mean, there were 3 standard slogans that were said every morning in the schools where I worked in, and the 3rd slogan was, we strive for Yemeni unity. And that was the one political slogan that was popular throughout the country. Yemenis from the People's Democratic Republic who wanted to work in Saudi Arabia would cross the border, get a passport from Sana'a, because once they had a Sana'a passport, they had a number of privileges when they're working in Saudi Arabia, basically of not being treated like foreigners. Whereas if you went to Saudi with a PDRY passport, you had the same restrictions as other foreigners. So you had a lot of intermarriage, you had, very considerable coherence. So basically, unity was a dream, I think, that, I would say almost every Yemeni believed in the 80s. When unity actually happened in 1990, I think people were half disbelieving and incredibly happy about it. The fact that it collapsed and that it became was basically because what ended up happening was not a unity in which both Yemenis throughout the country would be able to live and flourish. What happened is that the ruling system, the very autocratic and kleptocratic ruling system of Ali Abdullah Saleh, was basically transferred to the rest of the country. And the Southerners weren't used to that. They were used to having social services, they were used to having schools, they were used to having medical services, they were used to having food and basic facilities that they could afford. And suddenly they found that all these things were gone. And so, that created the bitterness. In addition, I think, I will say this, publicly, I think I've said it before, the leadership of Ali Salem al-Bid was particularly unhelpful. I think the way he handled the problems with Ali Abdullah Saleh was pretty useless. I'm not saying that a better leadership would necessarily have avoided a crisis, but certainly it's a possibility. So I think I'll stop here, otherwise I'm going to go on for hours.
Yes, thank you very much. And Mr. Hiltermann, the next question will be for you, because we have been talking about the failure of Saleh's regime and the consequences that it has had. But obviously, under pressure of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Salah agreed to a national dialogue conference that was established in order to aim for a smooth transition of power for 2 years, with then Vice President Abu Rabu Mansour Hadi to become the next president. However, the NDC failed in its task. and the failure of the NDC and its dissatisfaction with Hadi's ruling have revealed the damage of political reality, especially leading the Houthis to attack the capital city Sanaa, the Battle of Sanaa, in which they seized control of the city. The then Trump administration designated these Houthi rebels, they designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which President Biden reversed in this year. However, the Houthis were also part of the NDC. So we have been talking about North-South and about different tribes, but could you maybe explain to us who the Houthis are and what are their aims within the conflict?
So the Houthis have a particular history within the Yemeni context. They're a political group, but they're also a clan. They started as a family, the Houthi family, a large family, in the north, in Saada. The sort of the main figure in the movement was a member of parliament in the early 1990s, and then had a falling out and went into insurgency essentially. And that led to 6 rounds of conflict between the Houthis, this family, and their followers in the north, and the central government, which was not very, well, it was centralized, but it wasn't particularly controlling most of the country. But the point about that sort of started that conflict was the introduction of a particular religious element into the north that had not traditionally been there, and these were the Salafis. Because the Salafis had also a certain influence in the government of Ali Abdullah Salah. And the Houthis religiously, so they're a political group, but religiously they're part of the Zaydi community, who are the Shia of Yemen, but not of the same type as in Iran and Iraq, for example. They're much closer to the Sunnis in their practices than the 12 Shias in the Mashriq in Iraq and Iran. And so, but they felt particularly threatened by the introduction of these Salafis who were much more intolerant of other religious beliefs into what they saw as their territory, even though of course it's all part of Yemen. And so they resisted that, and it led to this conflict between the state and this group and its followers. And there was 6 rounds of conflict before 2011. And essentially the Houthis won that or fought the government to a stalemate. And so they ended up controlling more and more terrain in the north, and that was at 2011. Then when Ali Abdullah Saleh was essentially overthrown or pushed aside, the Houthis said, okay, we'll come back to politics. And there's a national dialogue conference, we'll participate. Because in the end, we have political aims like everybody else. They just took up arms for a period. Of course, they kept their arms during this new stage as well. And then when the dialogue conference collapsed, essentially, the Houthis said, to hell with this. We're going to press for our demands through the weapons that we have and through our force. And they made common cause with Ali Abdullah Saleh, the ousted president, and his forces, who is also from the Zaydi community. And they jointly then invaded Sana'a, the capital, and ousted Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, the interim president. And so, but the thing is, the National Dialogue Conference collapsed really over, maybe there were a number of issues, but the key one was the nature of the Yemeni state and whether it should be a federal state with X number of regions, where the number X is really important, 2 regions or more regions. And this, the participants could not come to an agreement with. And in fact, in the future, that is going to be the main sticking point again. Has to be resolved somehow. Because the people in the south, they want separation, or some anyway, the most active, the STC, they want to separate and create again 2 Yemens, essentially. But that is deeply threatening to groups in the north, including the Houthis, including the current government, the legitimate government, who want to have either a single state or a state that has several regions so that no single region can separate. And so this is an unresolved debate. But this is what happened in 2014, and the Houthis then took over the capital, and then went on to march south towards Aden, and then that triggered an intervention by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and then the war started.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have some more questions about the Houthis and their deal with the Hadi government as well. Udisi, if you would like to take the floor.
I think you have already answered it partly on it. So I would just like to move on to the involvement of foreign powers, especially the regional powers of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and the US. What is exactly, Saudi Arabia is alleging the Houthis are being supported by Iran, while the separatist movement, the STC, is being supported by United Arab States. So what is exactly at stake for them in this civil war that is happening within the country? And where does the USA fit in the story?
You're asking me still?
Yeah, to you,
Yes.
to Mr. Hiltermann.
Sure. Okay, yeah, so first of all, this is a civil war. This is an internal conflict in Yemen. It's important to understand that. But regional regional relations have affected or shaped the way the conflict has become worse inside Yemen, and the direction it has taken. So, so as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates intervened when the Houthis, who they saw as supported by Iran, moved southward, and they pushed them out of the south. But until today, the Houthis control still the largest part of at least the most densely populated parts of Yemen, the northern highlands and then some other areas. The thing is with Iran, yes, ideologically, the Houthis from the beginning, politically, aligned themselves with Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it was mostly rhetorical. There was no effective coordination, cooperation between the two. But it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Saudis accused them of this and attacked them. And then the Houthis had nowhere else to turn for support against the Saudis and the Emiratis except to Iran. So over time, the link between Iran and the Houthis became much stronger after 2015. And so today, yes, the Houthis are supported by Iran. There's no question about it. That doesn't mean the Houthis that doesn't mean that Iran controls what the Houthis do, but there absolutely is a link. And when the Saudis accuse the Houthis of having that link, they're right, that link exists. Of course, the Houthis say that Saudi Arabia is supported by the United States. So, I mean, everybody's supported by somebody. And this is what makes the conflict so much worse, because Saudi Arabia, of course, is inside Yemen and is bombing civilian areas as it is bombing the Houthi rebels. But where does it get its weapons? Well, from the United States. The UAE is there, and it gets its weapons also from the United States and from Britain and from France, mostly. So, and some from Germany, and some from here, and some from there. But those are the three main ones. And so the Iranians say, what are you talking about? The Houthis have very little support, and we don't give them weapons. I think maybe they do, or they give them parts, and they give them some technology, and they give them some training, and this and that. But it doesn't even compare. But the Houthis are now, in the last 3 or 4 years, have really armed themselves up, and now they're sending missiles into Saudi Arabia. And this, of course, is deeply threatening to the Saudis. They have sometimes missiles raining down on their populated area, on their cities. So this is becoming very, very dangerous regionally. It's no longer just a civil war in Yemen. It's becoming a proxy conflict and could become a regional conflict if it is not contained. So this happened under the Trump administration. Under Biden has made clear that he wants the war to come to an end. Biden is talking to the Iranians over the nuclear deal, but as long as those don't come to fruition, I don't think you'll see any progress on these other regional files. The Saudis are tired of the war. The Emirates already withdrew from Yemen. They're fed up. The Saudis are fed up too, but they cannot afford to just withdraw, because then they think the Houthis will come after them, and they will. So they need to come to a deal with the Houthis, but they cannot do it without American support and without talking to the Iranians. Now, we've just seen that the Saudis have started to talk to the Iranians directly about Yemen, and that is a giant step forward, even if it's still very modest in terms of what needs to happen. So that's where we are now, but we need to de-escalate, as Helen said at the very beginning, it's a Yemeni, no, sorry, it was Peter Hof who said it's a conflict that must be resolved by the Yemenis. But the outside parties, the regional states, the global actor, the United States, need to enable them to do so. That means they have to withdraw to some extent, to stop sending arms for offensive purposes, and to push the sides to the negotiating table and to enable them to come to a deal.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Hiltermann. And I would love to come back to this question about the future, in the part of looking at the future about the Houthis' involvement and the involvement of how US can de-escalate. But I want to turn to you, Ambassador Hof. As Dr. Hiltermann has pointed out, the US, and UK and France have been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, for which many international reports have been pointing out that Saudi Arabia has been alleged of committing crimes war crimes in Yemen. Interestingly, in 2016, the Dutch parliament banned the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and it got extended to Egypt in 2018. Despite the ban, in 2019, by a Dutch report, it was revealed that the Dutch banks such as ING and ABN AMRO invested $617 million in armed companies which were selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, who are taking part in the internal war in Yemen. So in this case, I was wondering, to what extent do you think you can hold these private companies accountable in breaking government sanctions against arms export?
Well, that's an interesting question. Of course, our arms, we've got clear as Netherlands arms export policy, as you have underlined, and based on the rules we have as the Netherlands, I'm not an expert on that, companies need to apply for permits whenever they want to export arms. Analysis is made and a permit is given or not, depending on the country, depending on the type of export, etc. These regulations are very rigorous, and as you've rightly pointed out from the beginning, we have not, our Dutch companies have not supplied arms to any of the warring parties. We've always taken as the Netherlands an independent position with regard to the conflict, meaning that we have a large history in the country. We have development cooperation program of over 40 years, which is the longest lasting development cooperation relationship we do have as the Netherlands. We've always invested in Yemen, in its people, and we haven't withdrawn, also not during the war. While many donors have left, many development cooperation donors have left, we have not left. We have continued our program. In addition, we are a strong humanitarian donor. When it comes to accountability, we are in Geneva leading the annual resolution on human rights in Yemen, which has set up the group of eminent experts, which reports on human rights violations in Yemen for all the parties. It's a report that's not often very welcomed by the parties, but we believe it's very important from a perspective of human rights, from a perspective of accountability. We have strengthened the resolution last year, making it possible for the group of eminent experts to look into mechanisms of accountability, and we believe that is vital for peace in Yemen. That we seek these mechanisms of accountability whenever crimes have been committed. We know that war crimes may have been committed, need to be investigated. We need to set up mechanisms to investigate, and that will apply to countries, that will apply to individuals, and that might also apply to companies. On the specific cases you have mentioned, I'm not aware of all the reports. As I told you, I'm not a Yemeni expert. But if rules are there and they have been violated, of course, they need to be investigated and subsequent action need to be taken. But on the individual cases you mentioned, I cannot comment because I do not have enough details on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We want to move on to the COVID-19, the humanitarian crisis at the current situation in Yemen. And I will give the floor to Martijn to continue.
Yes, so Mr. Hof, I would like to stay with you for a minute. According to the Humanitarian Need Overview, the HNO analysis estimated that 20.7 million people, or 66% of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance. Food insecurity and malnutrition are the main drivers behind this crisis. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic that we've already mentioned being on the rise, what has the role of foreign powers and NGOs specifically been up to this point in the humanitarian crisis?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. As has been mentioned by other speakers as well, Yemen is considered to be the biggest humanitarian crisis. We all know the data. 80% of the people need some form of humanitarian aid. 16 million people, over 16 million people are in acute need of, they're acutely food insecure. Millions of children. COVID has come on top of that. We do not have many COVID data because in the north, basically the Houthis deny that COVID exists, even though several of their leaders have been, well, some of them have died, others have been severely ill in the last months. But there are no precautionary measures taken. The first batches of vaccines have arrived in the country, but vaccination up till now has only happened in the south. It's going very, very slow. The health infrastructure is in shambles. Less than half of the hospitals are still functioning. So this crisis you mentioned is enormous. The humanitarian crisis is enormous. When it comes to the role of the international community, I think the problem is twofold. Well, it's manifold, but let me mention two. One is a severe lack of humanitarian funding. We've had a pledging conference a few weeks ago. The humanitarian fund of the UN has not even been filled for 50% for this year. So even the humanitarian needs that are there cannot be addressed. So that's one problem. The other problem is humanitarian access. Parties are hindering access of the UN, of the NGOs to the Yemeni that need assistance most. That is, these are the challenges with. What we do as humanitarian community is, first of all, be united. We engage in humanitarian diplomacy. We had last week important meeting in Brussels, the senior officials meeting, where we basically reaffirmed basically what we call the 7 asks. These are demands of the international community, and that includes government, donors, and NGOs, and organizations like the International Red Cross. The 7 asks to all the parties in the conflict with regard to humanitarian access. It includes issues like no taxation of humanitarian aid, issues like biometrics, like approval of agreements with organizations that are present in the country, unrestricted access, respect for independence of humanitarian access, and facilitate humanitarian staff entry. So we are consistent as donors and as international community, lobbying with all the parties to the conflict. It might be the Houthis, it might be the government of Yemen, the STC, the NRF forces in the West Coast, basically all the actors, to basically allow unhindered humanitarian access to the country. And that is a challenge, although there have been some improvements lately. I'm happy to say that. Signed the biometrics program of the WFP, the World Food Program, is being accepted, and pilot has started. So some progress is being made, but it is insufficient. So we continue as international community in our humanitarian diplomacy. I also raise this in all the meetings I have with all the actors that humanitarian access is vital and is absolutely necessary. What we do see in both parts of the country, and humanitarian access is more complicated, I would say, in the north than in the south, but there are challenges in both parts of the country. But in the south, we see it's partly due to a lack of government presence, unclarity who is governing, who submits permits, slow government bureaucracy. On the north, it is basically the distrust of the Houthis towards the international community, the control, the repression, the regulations, the lack of permits, also declaring many of the UN officials persona non grata, harassment of INGOs, of humanitarian officials, violation of humanitarian principles. And what comes on top of all that is the new, and that's something that really concerns us, also as the Netherlands, the new Machram Rule, which is being implemented, basically saying that women can only, that female humanitarian workers can only travel if they are accompanied by a male relative, which makes it basically impossible for these Yemeni women to help to provide aid, which is important because, of course, often you need Yemeni humanitarian aid workers, female humanitarian aid workers, to reach Yemeni women. So it's a big concern to us, but at the international community, we consider bring these humanitarian messages across to all the actors. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. Mrs. Lackner, obviously you have done quite a bit of research on the topic. What, in your opinion, have been the role of foreign powers and NGOs up to this point in the humanitarian crisis?
Well, I think, Peter has really covered the territory of the activities of the humanitarian sector. The only thing I would ask, maybe he can answer that, is I had a look recently, yesterday, at the FTS, and I was actually quite impressed because it looked as if the humanitarian response plan for this year is now financed at 43%, which is almost halfway through the year and almost half of the amount required, which is significant. It looked to me like significant progress on earlier situations. So maybe he can correct me on this one. I think the important thing is, I think all the factors that he has mentioned are extremely important. I think on the other side, you also need to look at the fact that there are very large numbers of particularly international NGOs that are now involved, mostly on contract to UN from UN financing. A lot of these, are coming into Yemen with possibly a lot of experience of humanitarian crisis, but very little experience of Yemen, and very little understanding of the culture and the way things are done in Yemen. And I think that presents a problem probably both for themselves and for Yemenis. So I think these things should be, taken into consideration. I think another element, which is, the fact that a substantial proportion of the humanitarian aid is coming directly from the Saudis, the King Salman Fund, on the King Salman Relief and something or other fund, and from the Emiratis, who give it through their Red Crescent. And both of these, I think, are much more politicized than, of course, the UN input, which makes every effort it can to avoid the politicization and to, combat politicization, as Peter just explained. And I think the result of that is that significant proportions of assistance may well be going to people who don't need it. Whereas a lot of people who do need it very desperately aren't getting it for the reasons Peter explained. And I think one thing that's important to remember when you're thinking about Yemen is 70% of Yemen's population is still rural. And the assumption is because people are rural, they grow their own food and they can eat and they can survive, you know, without assistance. In fact, the opposite is true. Before the crisis started, Yemen was already importing 90% of its staples, you know, wheat, rice, and basically the staples. And that's for a whole host of complicated reasons, including population increase, including the water crisis, including the increasingly small holdings that people had, which are inadequate and insufficient to keep people going, the deterioration of terraces, which means that there's less and less rain-fed agriculture, etc. I mean, I won't go into details of this, but what it does mean is that the people in greatest need tend to be the ones who are in the most remote locations and therefore the hardest people to reach, even without all the constraints that Peter has mentioned. And these constraints are extremely significant and relevant. But what they mean is that, you know, any sack of wheat or sack of rice that is leaving Hodeidah to reach the heights in Reima or in Tamar, not only does it have to deal with, get through all these checkpoints, etc., but on top of it, you know, there's a multiplicity of checkpoints, there's the increase in the price of fuel on the way, there's the increase in the number of people involved in the number of checkpoints, so that the price of the good, of the commodity when it actually reaches this location is, you know, is significantly increased. And again, we need to remember that, you know, most humanity is also coming in through commercial channels and then goes to, you know, goes through the humanitarian sector, i.e. people are being given cash by WFP to purchase food. So if the price of food increases, obviously they get less food. So I think these are additional factors that really need to be taken into consideration, you know, other than all the ones that Peter has mentioned, which are very important. Thank you.
Yes, and I would like to go a bit more in depth in one of the reasons behind the current crisis and why it is so hard to get humanitarian aid, which is needed to location, and that is the humanitarian blockade performed by Saudi Arabia. And obviously that is worsening the crisis in Yemen. And furthermore, the Houthis and others are also misusing the aid given by the international community. Obviously, we have already been talking about influences from abroad, but to what extent can the international community pressure both Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis to ensure that the aid is reaching the population adequately, Mrs. Lackner?
Well, I think, you know, the blockade of Hodeidah and the other ports and the difficulties of bringing in food, whether it's humanitarian or otherwise, has caused a lot more deaths than any amount of bombing that has taken place or even of day-to-day fighting that's taken place in the past 6 and now almost 6.5 years. And the problem, it's not the problem is people are dying. One of the issues that people like us have to deal with is that this is not, you know, somebody who dies of starvation because the port has been blockaded, because no fuel has been allowed in. Remember, you need the fuel to transport the food in addition to needing it for water supply and for all kind, you know, and for electricity and for hospitals, generators, etc., etc. So, you know, you need the fuel, you need the food, but most people don't die literally of starvation. What people die from is that hunger and, you know, physical weakness resulting from a long period of malnourishment, and we're talking here about years, weakens the body, makes them much more liable to any disease, including diarrhea, for example, which does kill them. In addition to that, of course, there's nothing remotely looking like adequate births and deaths registers in Yemen. So, you know, what you have is estimates of the number of people dying, and you have the occasional television program that shows you, you know, starving children in a hospital. But the fact is that the blockade of the port is primarily affecting fuel, which is relevant for all the things I mentioned, and obviously food. And certainly, ending the blockade of the port is, would be a major step forward to improving the humanitarian situation. I mean, I think it was about early 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Peter or your host can correct me on this. When there was the first outcry about this blockade, or one of the outcries, and they said, oh, well, we have alternatives, take a quick look at Yemen, bring the stuff in through Salah and Al Raida and Nishtun, it's only 1,500 kilometers overland, bring it to Aden. That means it gets under the hands of the STC, who don't want it to get up to the north. So that creates any number of problems. They even suggested bringing it to Jizan. Bringing it from Jizan in Saudi Arabia means, going through, active military fronts on pretty inadequate roads. We're not talking about dual carriageways, of European standards. So, this ending the blockade of the port, I think, is more important even than ending the blockade of Sana'a airport, though of course both are extremely important. But in terms of humanitarian supplies and hunger and disease and death, the blockade of the port is the most important element. And that is where, influencing, because the Saudis are preventing, stuff from arriving. So when ships have been cleared by the United Nations verification mechanism, they still get held up for unknown reasons for incredibly long periods. I forgot you were going to ask this question, so I didn't check the actual list of how many ships have been allowed in with fuel. I know that not a single ship was allowed in with fuel from January to end of March, and then in April 4 were allowed in. There have been a few more since, but as I said, I'm sorry, I forgot to check the figures today. So I think that more or less answers your question. Yes,
it does. Thank you very much. And obviously you have already kind of started this topic. We would also like to focus a bit more on the future. So you've already said that stopping the blockade of Saudi Arabia will resolve some of the tension that there is. And obviously, this is for you, Mr. Hiltermann, with President Biden announcing that the United States will stop supporting the Saudi-led war, in what direction should the international community should be going in bringing new negotiations, given that the UN and the US will still support the GCC initiative?
So, there is a UN special representative who has been leading the negotiations toward a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And he's had predecessors who have done the same. The current one is Martin Griffiths from Britain. He is about to leave. They'll be replaced by someone else. The UN effort has at times come close to some kind of deal. In fact, at the end of the Obama administration, there was an opportunity to close the deal, didn't happen. I think because the Saudis got cold feet when they saw that Biden might be replaced by somebody more hardline. Obama might be replaced by somebody more hardline. They weren't even thinking of Trump; they were thinking of Hillary Clinton. So they thought we better wait. Then, of course, Trump came into office, and then with his enmity or his administration's enmity toward Iran, all bets were off. And so now Biden has come in and said, well, we need to go back because clearly this is not working. But at this point, the situation has dramatically changed. And the UN envoy is basically stuck in a UN Security Council resolution from 2015, namely 2216 is the number. And it still identifies the main belligerents, if you want, the main conflict parties, as the government of Mansour Abu Hadi, the president, and the Houthis. So two parties. But the fact is that there are many parties fighting each other in Yemen at the moment. There's also, for sure, the STC in southern Yemen, but there are other groups as well. And so it's very hard to see how you can make peace when only two parties are at the table. So there's one thing is wrong with the current structure. Now, you could change that without having a new Security Council resolution, but it would require some international consensus and action at the Security Council level. So that's one that would need to happen. So the talks are not sufficiently inclusive. You could also argue that they're also not inclusive of civil society, and others who have a major stake in the outcome of the negotiations if you want the peace to be durable. And so that's so they're not non-conclusive in different ways. Secondly, what may happen in the next 2 or 3 months is that the Houthis may defeat the government forces in Marib, which is essentially the last government stronghold. And if that happens, everything changes. Because then you end up with actually 2 parties to the conflict, but I mean Yemeni parties, one the Houthis, the other one the SDC in the south, with the government still, pockets here and there, and still claiming to be the legitimate government, of course, but having no real power. So if that happens, the UN will have to adjust again. And so it becomes very difficult to see how you then make progress on peace talks when the Houthis say, listen, we've essentially won. What are you talking about? Recognize us. We are the legitimate government. We hold the government institutions in Sana'a. You may not like us, but here we are. The SDC says, well, the Houthis, they can say whatever they want. They're in Sana'a. We will split off from Yemen and create an independent state, or we split off in another way. It doesn't matter. So we have nothing to do with that. And then let's see what the Saudis and the Emiratis say if they're happy with the situation. The Saudis less than the Emiratis probably. And then what are the Americans going to do, or the Europeans who have not even military power? So all of this is making progress on political talks extremely difficult, while it is absolutely essential that there be progress in order to end the humanitarian crisis, because humanitarian aid alone is not going to do it. You have to actually, because the thing is, because the blockade of Hodeidah, for example, is linked to political issues, and the Saudis are not going to lift the blockade for humanitarian reasons. They will provide humanitarian, they'll fund humanitarian efforts, but they're not going to lift the blockade unless there's a quid pro quo from the Houthi side. And then you get into long negotiations about what each side should give, and it comes down to, what is the overall end state that we can agree to. And this is exactly the problem that we face today. So I'm not very hopeful at the moment, to be honest, about the prospect of this war coming to an early is not early, 6 years late, but coming to an end anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. And then concerning more specific agreements which have been put in place and which have been tried before, there is the Stockholm Agreement, which was brokered by the UN in 2018, and it was seen as a hope for further peace negotiations, but it seems to be faltering. What are the obstacles to this agreement that is stalling future political negotiations to end the war? This question is still to you, Mr. Hiltermann.
Well, so the Stockholm Agreement was between the Houthis and the government of Abu Trabu Mansur Hadi, and it was about the siege of Hodeidah that was taking place at the time by Yemeni forces under the nephew of Ali Abdullah Saleh, supported by the United Arab Emirates military forces. And so the siege, threatened to oust the Houthis from Hodeidah and to put the port in the hands of the legitimate government. But that would not have solved the blockade that the Houthis are under, because it would have just moved the blockade from the port into the mountains, because you would still have to cross foodstuffs from the port on the road to Sana'a and other areas that the Houthis controlled. So it wouldn't have solved anything. And I think the Trump administration, and it's one of the few good things they did at the time, is they realized that things had gone too far. And also, this was just at the time that Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince in particular had overstepped his certain line that even the United States under Trump maintained. It was a very thin line, I would say, through the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And that, for many people in Congress, in the US Congress, that was just, a bridge too far. And they also saw that the war in Yemen, supported by the US military, was becoming an embarrassment and also was militarily unwinnable. So they said, why are we funding this? So all of this came together at that time. And so the United States decided to organize these talks in Sweden and to basically push these two parties, put their heads together and say, listen, you have to come to a deal. So they came to a deal, but they didn't really want to. And so the implementation hasn't really worked because neither side really wants to comply with the terms. And of course, they both accuse each other of breaking it or of not implementing it. So it could have been a good precedent for an overall peace deal, but instead it's just an augur of a future without an overall peace deal. Unfortunately, since then we've seen after this Stockholm Agreement, the Riyadh Agreement, which was between the Hadi government and the STC in the south. And this the Saudis brokered. It was very important. And it even led to the Hadi government sending its cabinet into Aden to take their seat, but most of them have left by now. And it's also not working. So, and the Saudis are not really pressing for its implementation. So basically everything is back to default mode. And the Houthis are advancing on Ma'rib, as I said, and that will change everything. So that's where we are today.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, there are more agreements have been tried to reach. Uditi, would you maybe take over and discuss the next question?
I think Dr. Hiltermann already touched on the Riyadh Agreement a bit, but you, Ms. Lackner, you also have mentioned in one of your articles that the Riyadh Agreement is on the verge of collapsing because of the strategic plans of Saudi Arabia and UAE. So I was wondering, what were the kind of the main agreements within the Riyadh Agreement, and why was it seen like a scene towards stability and improvement of state institutions between the STC and the Hadi government?
Yeah, thank you for this. I think I'll basically reinforce some of what Host has just said about agreements in general. I think first let's remember that the origin of the Riyadh Agreement was an actual military battle between the Southern Transitional Council and the Hadi government. Now, officially, the Southerners are part of the Hadi government and the coalition. But in 2017, a group calling itself the Southern Transitional Council basically split off and decided that they wanted to separate and be the representatives of the South. They've done this basically with enormous amounts of support, diplomatic, financial, and military from the United Arab Emirates. And it's important to remember, and we didn't get round to it earlier when we're talking about the South, that not everybody in the South supports the Southern Transitional Council. Not only is that the case, but there are a lot of people in the South who are not separatists, who still believe in Yemeni unity. And even amongst the separatists, the Southern Transitional Council are really a small fraction. If you look at the section of Yemen that they have control, it is very, very small, and it basically stops about 70 kilometers east of Aden, beyond a place called Zinjibar and before a place called Shukra. And so, you know, the reason they've become so prominent is basically the UAE support. Without the UAE support, they would not, you know, most people outside of Yemen would never have heard of them. Those of us who are deeply involved would have heard of them, just as we've heard of another 5, 6, or 7 organizations that now no one has heard of. So what happened is that, you know, they, and if you want to bring it to, you know, to say at least a regional or I don't want to use the word tribal, but a certain regional vision. In a sense, you can say that the STC represents the leadership that won the war, the civil war in 1986, and who are originally primarily from parts of the governorate of Daler and the governorate of Lahej. And of course, everybody's in Aden because it's the capital, so everybody has to be there. And some small bits of Abyan. I mean, the distribution of governorates is confusing because it overlaps all kinds of other social and other categories. Whereas the Hadi government represents the faction that was defeated in 1986 and coming from that area. So there's still, you know, an enormous level at which this is a consequence of the problems within the PDRY in 1986. And one question I often ask myself is, why do the young men from either of these factions go and fight each other when they have no great reason to be doing so? So it's important to remember that the STC is only one southern faction. But to come back to the issue of the Riyadh Agreement, in August 2019, the STC basically militarily evicted the Hadi government out of Aden. And there was from between August and November of that year, the Saudis actively tried to reconcile the two so that they would work together. And the Riyadh Agreement is the reconciliation agreement between these two factions. Now, to see how effective it's been, you have to note that this agreement was signed in November 2019 to create a formed joint united government, which itself was created, and I'm not making a mistake in my dates, in December 2020. In other words, it took more than 12 months to even reach this agreement. During these 12 months, there was fighting between the two groups. Since then, there's been fighting between these two groups. Right now, there is not, to my knowledge, any fighting between these two groups because another southern separatist faction, the Amalika, is basically acting as a buffer between them. But both sides are getting ready for another fight. So what is particularly, aside from the fact that I think everyone has mentioned here in this meeting, that fundamentally the problem is a Yemeni problem, and the only way it's going to be solved is by Yemenis. In this particular context, we also have an increasing set of problems emerging between the Saudi regime and the Emirati regime. Because although they have their own differences elsewhere, and in other countries, let alone in terms of their internal economic policies, Yemen is really where their differences are focused. And although, 3 or 4 years ago, everybody talked about the wonderful relationship between MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the acting effective ruler of the Emirates, and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as a wonderful love, well, maybe not love, but close relationship of mentor, mentee, etc., etc. Now there's very little said about this because, the problems between these two are increasing. So basically, the conclusion is exactly what Rost said earlier. The Riyadh Agreement basically is getting nowhere fast. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your answers. As you have mentioned, all three of you have mentioned that the Yemeni problem can only be solved by Yemeni people. And in this case, I actually want to focus a little bit on the inclusion of women and civil society organizations. Mr. Hof, you have mentioned that the women, the Houthi, the rule, the Machram Rule, where women can only travel only if they are being accompanied by male. So why is it that important that should hear the voices of women and the Yemeni civil society, and why should they be involved in the peace process in solving the Yemen crisis?
Thank you. Yes, it is. It's a good question and a bad question at the same time, because it is, of course, strange that you have to argue why women should be present when they represent half of the Yemeni population. So it's of course odd to exclude 50% of the population from the outset in a peace process. But that's not that's not the only thing. I think also experience from other countries shows that peace processes are more durable, more successful if they're more inclusive. If women have and it's not just about a seat at the table, it's about a meaningful role in the process, then the peace treaties are more likely to hold. So there is there's a case, a very strong case to be made. And my personal opinion is that basically the chaos in Yemen has been almost for 99% been organized by men. So I think if somebody should stay quiet about the future of Yemen, it should be it maybe should be the men. It's maybe you could argue that it's women's turn now. We are, as Netherlands, supporting a Yemeni organization, the Peace Track Initiative. We're organizing an important conference later this month on a feminist roadmap to peace. I would like to invite everybody, I don't know where you exactly register, but to participate, because this is indeed a conference in which it's not the women's voice, because there are many women's voices. There are, of course, many different voices from women's groups, from individuals. And these are expert voices, because there are many women, female experts in Yemen that can contribute on many issues, that have an important thing to say, see it at the table. So we proudly support this conference. Our Minister for Foreign Affairs will be opening the conference, but it will be mainly Yemeni women and men, because when we talk about women's participation, that's as much an issue for men as it is for women. We all should be striving for women's inclusion, for youth inclusion, for civil society inclusion, because the only way forward for Yemen is through an inclusive peace deal. That means that it's not only the parties that are fighting the war should be at the table, and that has been already expressed by Joost and by Helen. It would be a far too limited process to have just the warring factions sitting at the table trying to make a peace. If you really lasting, durable peace in Yemen, you need to have all these voices from civil society, from women's organizations, from youth organizations, from minorities as well at the table. I think that's the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answer, Ambassador Hof. What is your view on this, Dr. Hiltermann? What do you think? Because Crisis Group has specifically written an article on this and even held a conference with women's inclusion in the peace process.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have published a report on this, and it's on our website. Anybody can access it. It's www.crisisgroup.org. So what Ambassador Hof says is absolutely right, and the buy-in from inclusivity and buy-in from a diverse and representative cross-section of the population is really key to the durability of any peace deal that can be reached. But there's a second factor too, I would say, in the case of Yemen at least, maybe elsewhere too, which is, first of all, we need to understand that women are not automatically peacemakers. The fighters themselves, the male, there may be women who fully support what they do. But what we have seen is that as the men are fighting, the women gain a certain autonomy locally and can do more than they normally could if they were just, under male orders, basically. And so what we've seen is a flourishing civil society at the local level, where organizations are often run by young people and including women. Now, including in local peace efforts. Now, this is quite different from the national level peace process, where I already said the negotiations are stuck. But at the local level, there have been a number of breakthroughs, but you would need to document them very carefully because they're not visible to the outside eye. They're reported locally, of course, they're known, but they're not internationally visible. So, but it turns out that women activists in particular, but also others, have been prominent in negotiating local prisoner releases, access issues for humanitarian aid, and there's other examples. So that experience is really useful for the national level negotiations if and when they come to that point. So you need also to draw in people with that kind of experience, because in the end, they can help implement any peace deal on the ground through their experience.
Thank you so much. It was quite enlightening about what you have mentioned about the women's role in the peace process and local initiatives on the local ground, and then bring it to an international platform. In this sense, I want to ask you the last question to you, Ms. Lackner. It has been mentioned that you have advocated for the EU to play a more active role. So in that sense, how can the European Union play this active role in the peace process, despite the fact that, as Dr. Hiltermann pointed out, they do not have a military power?
Well, I think the important element here is that, you know, what was mentioned earlier by both the ambassador and Rios, that, you know, the peace discussions at the moment under the UN are constrained by Resolution 2216, and that this constraint is totally unrealistic, even if it was possibly implementable, sorry about the word, in 2015, even by 2016, it was no longer realistic, let alone today. I mean, what it says fundamentally is Houthis, go home to where you were in 2012 or 2013 and forget about everything you've won and achieved for the last 7 years. They're obviously not going to do that. So, you know, the UN, you know, the last 3 special envoys and the forthcoming special envoy, whoever he or she might possibly be, you know, cannot deal with this unless there is a change in 2216. The European and the EU in particular, I mean, the EU, number one, represents 27 states. And actually, from this point of view, sitting in England, I have to say the fact that Britain is out of the EU might be an asset rather than a hindrance, an issue which on other aspects one may speak quite differently. But the EU 27 have a much better reputation everywhere in Yemen than either the US or the Brits or the UN. I mean, the Netherlands has a particularly good reputation because of its involvement, as the ambassador explained earlier, its involvement in development activities now for many, many decades, and it's well known throughout the country, particularly in rural areas where it was financing, you know, a lot of domestic water supplies, which means that it's known by everybody. Germany also has an excellent reputation. France, of which I happen to be a national, has a slightly less good reputation because it's more considered seen as an arms dealer. But, you know, at least you have, you know, 2 Italy's relatively well seen. So you have, you know, the EU and European states are viewed much more positively by Yemenis, but on all sides, and I'm including the Houthis. I agree that the Houthis basically are suspicious of all foreigners and all Europeans, but they are probably that little bit less suspicious of the EU and the Netherlands and Germany than they are of others. And, you know, because the UN is so constrained and now has a history basically of 7 years of failure, you know, it's a very good opportunity. And I think it's worth noting that, you know, with the developments of the last few days, when there clearly seems to be some serious, you know, diplomatic attempts to maybe get somewhere, you know, the Yemeni foreign minister was in Brussels yesterday. He might still be there for all I know, and was meeting people. You know, the European don't have an army, but then the British army is not in Yemen, the US army is not in Yemen, and indeed, you know, except for a few Emiratis and a few Saudis, and a few mercenaries, you know, there are no foreign forces in Yemen. Well, as I said, except all the ones I've just listed. So, you know, the EU is in a position, should it choose to take a position independent and go beyond that of the following the UN lead, it can take initiatives which will be, I think, seen much more positively by Yemenis than those that are so currently followed. So I think that's really, you know, and in that sense, you know, the EU could contribute in debate, could contribute in negotiations, in addition to the activities of member states, because indeed, in addition to having an EU ambassador, we also have a Netherlands ambassador, we have a German ambassador, we have, you know, a whole host of other member states ambassadors active on Yemen. So I think this is a potential, not necessary to break the deadlock, because as we've all agreed, the issue is fundamentally a Yemeni issue. But as a facilitator, I think the EU could play a much bigger role than it has done in the past. And I know that, you know, some EU people have tried in the past and been constrained by the impositions on them made by the UN. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer, and hopefully the EU does play a bigger role, and hopefully there are future fruitful peace negotiations happening, even if not all of us are exactly hopeful at the moment. Despite that, we have reached the end of the webinar. However, we still have some time. So if you have any question, and I'm asking to the audience, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box.
Yes, I would like to start off with, I've already pre-received a question by Mr. Hackens. This was a question concerning the oil tanker, which is currently decaying in front of Yemen, and the potential consequences it might have for the humanitarian crisis and Yemen and overall. Mr. Hof, I would like to start off with you. Could you maybe give us more an insight of the consequences of the tanker?
Yes, it's an excellent topic that we have not addressed yet. The FSO Safar, basically a reconstructed tanker, moored, contains, I believe, 1.1 million barrels of oil. Hasn't had maintenance over the last 6 years. It's over 45 years old. It can basically sink or explode or whatever disaster any moment. So this is really could be one of the major oil spills in world history, affecting millions of Yemeni. If it explodes, it will affect millions of Yemeni, but also if it sinks, if there's an oil spill, it will affect the Yemeni fishery sector. It will affect humanitarian aid, because it will block, basically, most likely, it might affect international shipping. So the consequences go further than just Yemen. Countries in the region like Saudi Arabia, Eritrea, Djibouti will be affected. This is really something, a disaster, a ticking time bomb, it has been called. A disaster bound to happen. We see it coming. We've seen it coming for the last 5 years, maybe even longer, but we haven't been able to solve it. And this is really a nightmare that keeps me awake at night. The UN has been negotiating now almost 2 years with the Houthis on sending an assessment mission to basically assess, see what needs to be done to get rid of the problem. And let me be very frank and undiplomatic. The problem lies with the Houthis that have not shown until now any willingness, serious willingness to solve the problem. Already in August 2019, a mission of the UN was in Djibouti, that at the last moment did not get a permission to sail towards the tanker. We are supporting the UN mission. We are financing part of the mission. We follow the negotiations closely. But the Houthis have been adding demand after demand to the UN in order basically to prevent reaching an agreement on, which is just the first phase, which is just an assessment, which does not even solve the problem, because that would be the second phase. So the ship lies in Houthi territory. There are Houthi military on board. It's really controlled by them, so we need to negotiate with Ansar Allah, with the Houthis, to resolve it, but they have not shown until now a willingness to go ahead with the UN proposed solution, and I'm not optimistic that that will happen very shortly, the UN process is getting increasingly difficult. Security Council has met again over it. It's made some clear statements, but we're not moving forward. Contingency planning is starting, which is vital, because if something happens, there have been cost estimates that it might cost to clean it up around $20 billion US. I'm not talking about million, but $20 billion US, so an enormous amount. The Yemeni government doesn't have it. The ship is not insured, so there's no insurance company that's going to pay for the cleanup. There's nobody there who's going to do it. So this is really a disaster waiting to happen, a ticking time bomb that we need to resolve, and we need to resolve it very fast, because it might be too late tomorrow, but it will certainly be too late in a few months, let alone a year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. As we are short on time, it will unfortunately be the end of our webinar. I would like to thank our experts for the evening. I'd also like to thank our viewers, which have watched during the live stream and both in the session and on Facebook. The Jason Institute will host one more webinar before our summer break, which is on the Syrian peace process, and it will be on the 24th of June. We will be back in September with many new events, and we will also be opening up applications for the activities committee. So if you are interested in joining our organization and in organizing and hosting events such as these and working together with experts, such as the one we have hosted tonight, let us know, and hopefully we will have the opportunity to work with you. You can also follow us on our social media to stay updated and not miss out. I would like to thank you all for watching. This will be the end.
Thank you so much again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Peter. Cheers.
Enjoy your evening.
Very nice meeting
Enjoy your
you.
evening.
Yes, likewise.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.